We are saving the best for last with a discussion of diagnostic reimbursement, patient access. We've got a great panel here today, and I know you guys have been really talked at all day, so I kind of find that the best value of these panels are really for Q&A. So definitely think about your questions and come up to the mic when you're ready. I have a few questions that I will pose to the panel as well. I wanted to just talk briefly about what's going on in healthcare in Washington right now. Start out with a macro view. I just have a couple of slides here, and then I'll drill down to personalized medicine and reimbursement in particular. I would just point to about 3 things for the remainder of the year in healthcare land. Reform with open enrollment having started on October 1st. This is obviously the new healthcare reform law, which the CBO estimates there'll be about 7 million newly enrolled through exchanges by the end of March next year, and about 9 million through the Medicaid expansion. Government funding and deficit reduction. We are just coming off of a government shutdown. We are currently funded until January 15th, and then hit our debt ceiling deadline February 7th, I think with extraordinary measures that gets you to sometime in March. The next catalyst, I would say, is Friday, December 13th, when the budget conferees are supposed to produce a report. There's nothing binding or punitive about that report happening, so I think members of the conference committee are trying to keep expectations low. And in my view, I don't really see a grand bargain materializing between now and the end of the year. Whether or not they address sequestration is something to look out for again in this conference report. And then the doc fix, which is something that expires at the end of the year. If you're a physician who treats Medicare patients, you're subject to somewhere between 24 and 25% pay cut as of Jan 1. And there are staffers in committees in both the House and the Senate that are trying to work out a longer term package, a 10-year package versus the 1-year patches. Sometimes it's just a 6-month or 2-month patch that Congress has tended to do over the last few years. This is a chart from Avalier. I realize that the font is probably like 6, but it's just, again, it's from Avalier. It's not my chart, but it's just a chart to depict that a lot of reform has already started. I think there's this throwaway comment that, oh, it all starts in 2014, but really with Part D, the donut hole, payment reductions to plans, readmissions, hacks for hospitals, et cetera. There are a lot of things that have already started. One thing I would say is that payment reform, particularly through the Affordable Care Act, there was a Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation that has embarked upon some demonstrations. Bundled payments, you may have heard the acronym BPCI, ACOs, Pioneer ACOs, these are things that are happening. Chronic care bundled payments is something that the agency is taking a look at and has actually issued an RFP on the renal side. So one thing I would just say is that payment reform is here to stay. And if you talk to Republicans, if you talk to Democrats, it's really something that is widely known and agreed upon, that treating chronic patients, expensive patients at times, managing those folks, and really having physicians working with hospitals, working with post-acute providers, this more efficient use of resources and communication is imperative. One thing that people ask me in my travels are, what are some major policy trends that you see? I just listed 4 here that I wanted to share with you. Number 1, really moving from a fee-for-service to a value-based payment system, which is what a lot of the demonstration projects were designed to do. Number 2, realignment of the payer market, which is just a way of saying that really post-14 with exchanges and with reform, the government is going to be dominating spending. Medicare, Medicaid, military health care, et cetera. Number 3, wellness and defined contribution. Employers are moving ahead with these types of programs, worrying about the health of their employees, also worried about costs. Recently you've seen some headlines about big companies trying to put their retirees and even some of their current employees into private exchanges. And then lastly, number 4, downward spending pressure, Medicare, Medicaid, employer-sponsored. Now I'm going to hone in a little bit on personalized medicine and introduce our panel. So personalized medicine is the goal. There are a number of government payment policies in play right now. In fact, we should be getting in a few weeks a whole slew of final 2014 regulations, the fee schedule, hospital outpatient. So there's just a whole lot going on. I won't go into detail about what a lot of those proposals are, but I'm sure we'll talk about them a bit today. Knowing that coverage does not necessarily equal payment, we're going to hear from some payers, obviously, on our panel and talk about that as well. What is the level of evidence that is needed? $64,000 question. And then companion diagnostics, something that clearly has been discussed quite a bit today. So why don't we get started? I'll have Dr. Powderly from Carolina Bio-Oncology Institute step up.
All right. Thank you, everyone. So I'm John Powderly. I'm a medical oncologist in full-time, community-based private practice. We heard earlier today that us community oncologists represent about 85% of all the cancer care going on in America. So I hope I can shed a little bit of light today on patient access and reimbursement. And our clinic's mission is personalized medicine. So we could make this a business story or a case study on can personalized medicine be deployable in a community-based setting. So first of all, we have a clinic on the left there called Carolina Bio-Oncology Institute. We're a cancer treatment center, so we see all sorts of tumors at our community-based hospital. We also are a research program. We're the only phase 1 research program that's independent on the East Coast. Most of them are based at academic centers. And Charlotte has the unique distinction. It's the largest city in America without a medical school. So we are the phase 1 program for a very large population, over 1 million people in Charlotte. And we also incubate a diagnostics lab, a research contract lab. It's a diagnostics lab. It's a CLIA lab where we help to do translational research, both genomic research, protein-based research. And my special interest is immunotherapy. We do immunotherapy research as well. So we thought, hey, a great idea to get personalized medicine to the market is just take the biotech company or the translational lab and bring it right on into the clinic, right? Bring it as close to the clinic as possible. So, but before we can do a case study on personalized medicine, we got to explain the market, okay? And this is a real simplified view of the market, how I see it in the trenches in community-based practice. That is, the pharmaceutical industry is a chemical process to make a product for the masses. Right? The biotech industry is a biologic process to make a biotech product for the masses. And personalized medicine is very different. Right? Now, how do we even define this market? We've got to define it so we can have investors and entrepreneurs have a return on their investment, right? Which is often way too long. And that's why personalized medicine is still viewed very risky and hasn't quite gotten foothold yet. So I look at personalized medicine as much more of a process than it is a product. It also, to me, it has to have a door for patients. You can't just have a diagnostic test somewhere in a corporation headquarters but not have a doctor explaining what does the genomic sequence mean, and having been trained in that and being able to have adequate reimbursement and having choices and applications to apply with that knowledge. So to me, that's much more of how I see personalized medicine. So then the next big question is personalized medicine a sustainable business model? At least in the community setting, this is where we're trying to apply it. That's where the market is right now. So this is how we're trying to do that, and I'll tell you about the trials and tribulations as we go through. So our clinic was founded in 2005, and the clinic itself provides oncology care and clinical access to patients. We've seen over 3,000 patients since 2005 and been proud to develop over 30 cancer drugs. Most of those are antibodies and vaccines and immunotherapy-based approaches, not too many small molecules or TKIs, but still a lot of those drugs we've seen get to market. In our Biocidics lab, Biocidics means applications of living cells, that lab focuses on circulating tumor cells. Why? Because we feel that the way to personalize medicine is not going to be through repeated invasive biopsies, right? It's going to be through more of a diagnostic approach just on CTCs. And we help to other companies either validate their capture device against the standard FDA predicate, the Veridex platform, and we also help other companies develop their companion, their diagnostic antibody, while they're on a phase 1 or phase 2 study. So it's a nice model from a business standpoint that we can host the clinical or the companion diagnostic and also the phase 1 therapeutic antibody itself. And we're developing autologous cellular immunotherapy platforms for the future as well. So this is just an example of our CLIA CAP accredited lab. There's the Veritex CTC enumeration platform. So nobody cares about counting dead cells, right, just for prognostic information. What we're really interested in is taking those dead cells downstream and exploiting them for biomarkers, looking for drug targets or other predictive markers. So a little bit about access. That's what this panel is going to focus on. Just to tell you where we're coming from. So North Carolina has a great biotech industry, so that's not a hurdle to provide personalized medicine. North Carolina is the third largest biotech industry, the #1 fastest growing biotech industry. We have no shortage of cancer. It's a tobacco state. You can see here, my little pointer can show you Mecklenburg County. Mecklenburg County is right in the left lower quadrant. It's the largest county with the highest aggregation of cancer in North Carolina. So we have lots of referrals from oncologists who will send for early phase access. We have an airport hub, 8th busiest airport in the world, over 100 million people, or a 90-minute flight to Charlotte. So we certainly have the ability to have access, physical access, for motivated metastatic cancer patients who want to come for personalized medicine or early phase studies. So, and as I told you, we focus on circulating tumor cells. We think that's the future of personalized medicine, the substrate, if you will, of oncology. This is an old atlas of circulating tumor cells right on a blood smear, but we know that nowadays we're much more molecular. We can capture CTCs right out of the bloodstream. As you've heard from today, there's an example for those of you that may not have seen CTCs. This is a fluorescent digital microscopy of intact CTCs on the left-hand side. So our platforms will count those individually. We also take those, like I said, downstream and do molecular testing for biomarkers. And there's no lapse in FDA clearance of the predicate device, the Veritex platform. So then we can say, well, can we really do personalized medicine because there's no FDA clearance of a device or platform? Well, that's not the case, because the Veritex platform is FDA cleared, and we can see it has very good prognostic data from large studies over predicting survival in the stage 4 setting for breast, colorectal, and prostate cancer. So we've got patient access. We've got a great biotech industry in Charlotte. We even got a predicate device to capture CTCs. So how come the model's not a huge success? Well, let's look a little deeper, see where the challenges are for personalized medicine. This is just some of our data to show that we have been busy over the past few years. These are a plot of all the values of circulating tumor cells in a single tube of blood from different patient draws on the left-hand axis there, CTCs per tube of blood. Down in the lower panel, you can see the different types of cancer: prostate, breast, lung, and colorectal, in a logarithmic scale, seeing that CTCs will go as high as the many thousands in some of our metastatic patients. So here's an example of how we can look at those circulating tumor cells for a companion or a biomarker of interest. This is a particular company we're working with called Progenics. They have an antibody against PSMA, prostate-specific membrane antigen, which is on prostate cancer and also on prostate CTCs. And their antibody is a drug conjugate, so it brings a toxic payload right to the drug target, to the PSMA on cancer cells. And so we're helping them find that drug target, that PSMA, in real time on blood draws on CTCs, and we're happy that we're the centralized reference lab for that phase 2 study with Progenics. So that's an example of some of the work we're doing. So, but I want to show you now on the challenges. What are the challenges? Why isn't personalized medicine thriving at our small clinic? Why aren't we having this model go across the United States in community-based practices? Well, one of the big issues, which hasn't really been touched on today, is that there is a lot of idle money being lost on the broken clinical trial system. Right? So we've talked about all these great diagnostics today, but what you still need at the core of those diagnostics are principal investigators in oncology doing clinical trial work. So I did some math. This is a couple years ago, but it's a great slide. I did some simple math on how much money we spend per day on cancer research, per investigator and per cancer patient. So you can look here in the top left-hand corner. That's our healthcare dollar, $1.3 trillion per year. Then let's break that down and look at just the cancer dollar itself. We actually spend $23 billion only on cancer research in the US. So I tell my colleagues that their piece of the pie, the oncologists, only You get a smaller amount of that money on the clinical services. So when you do the math, you add up the total amount of cancer research dollars spent there in green, and do a ratio with the cancer population, of which only 3% of cancer patients participate in trials. We spend, the bottom line, we spend $23 billion per year on 39,000 cancer patients that participate in clinical trials. So when patients ask me, geez, doc, we need to put more money into cancer research, I was like, well, true, but we actually already do put a lot of money into cancer research. You, dear patient, as a participant in research, are realizing $590,000 on your behalf just by participating in a single trial. And that's because of all the non-accrual and idle studies that are out there. There's $63 million spent per day. Many of that is just idle on studies that don't accrue. So I think the first fix, if you will, for personalized medicine is we need more principal investigators, we need more oncologists doing this in the community, and a better reimbursement system or incentive system for docs to want to be PIs. The second, this is my last slide, the second big hurdle right now, which is no surprise, but it's the drastic reimbursement changes going on in community-based oncology. So this is a map that's available on communityoncology.org. It shows the 1,300 cancer clinics in the United States that are community-based and the financial struggles that they're going through. You can see the red dots are the clinics closed. About 400 clinics have been closed. The yellow dots are ones that are struggling financially. The green are they're just simply sending their cancer patients across the street to the hospital to get chemotherapy. And the blue are those that have been bought by the hospital. And the purple are those that have been merged with their other oncologist colleagues just to stay afloat. So I'll stop here, and I'll skip this last slide because we'll talk about it when we have our discussion. So thank you.
Michelle?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for hanging around for the payment panel. I'm here to give you kind of an overview of, in the few minutes that I'm going to talk, I'm going to try to bridge the gap between how FDA looks at tests and how CMS looks at tests for reviewing things. I'm going to identify what that gap is and present some of the recent trends in clinical laboratory payment in the proposed rules that were just mentioned by Ipsita. And most likely, I'm just going to ask more questions than I actually answer. At the end of the day, the reimbursement process is critical to ensuring patient access, because you can have the greatest development come out of a basic research center, get applied in clinical research, get through the FDA with flying colors. But if insurance companies don't pay for it, very few people are going to have access to it in the bottom line. And so with this slide, I just wanted to highlight some differences between FDA and CMS. They're different agencies with different review standards, different missions. The FDA evaluates things according to a standard of is something safe and effective. Now, if you're a manufactured IVD kit, that is absolutely necessary but not sufficient for you to go through CMS's decision-making process, which is based on, is that medical service medically necessary and reasonable for the care of a patient? The other thing I wanted to point out is that while FDA focuses on each unit of product, each widget, for each specific intended use, decision makers in the payer community have to focus on categories of widgets, categories of biomarkers across all possible intended uses. And this may change in the coming days. You've probably all heard of the McKesson project or the Palmetto project. They're looking to create unique identifiers by devices, and that may be able to allow payers to make some determinations of medically necessary and reasonable right down to the level of a specific test versus a category of tests. And so I made this slide a bunch of years ago, but it still kind of holds true today, sadly. There are two hurdles if you're a manufacturer coming to the market. There's the demonstration of safety and effectiveness that leads to FDA clearance or approval or some other meeting of a clinical threshold for clinical or analytical validity, clinical validity. Depending on what submission route you take, it could take 90 to 180 days for a review. And then there's the second hurdle, which can be even bigger, of medical necessity and increasingly added value. Ipsita threw that term around just a few minutes ago. Before you can get coverage for insurance companies and for CMS, if they had to make a national decision, could take up to 3 to 5 years. Most of those decisions are going to be at a local level, however. While you're doing your clinical studies for FDA, your device is going to be considered developmental or experimental and probably not be covered by the insurance companies. But at some point, an insurance company that does provide coverage, this test will become widely used. It'll become more and more in the standard of care. You may see practice guidelines being developed. You may see more comparative effectiveness research going on. But in the middle, there's a gap. I mean, how do you make that transition between FDA and CMS? And who's the best to translate this activity? Is it something like an FDA post-approval study? Does FDA own that process? Does CMS own that process? Is something like coverage with evidence development? Or can it be some kind of joint process with parallel review? Who knows? I think those are some good questions for this panel. But I think the goal is to ultimately streamline that process, make it less of a two-humped camel, and more of a more predictable and objective, standardized path to market. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about payment. The reimbursement process is two distinct decision-making processes here in the United States. There's coverage. Is it medically necessary and reasonable for the treatment of illness or injury for a particular patient? And payment, and payment decision-making involves, if that is covered, then how much is it going to be worth? So just to update you on the clinical laboratory fee schedule, as Ipsita showed in her reform chart, that there's some high-level activities that's been going on for some time targeting facilities and provider groups. CMS has taken a clear focus in desire to become more of an active purchaser of high value and high-quality healthcare services. They're moving away from fee-for-service to fee-for-value. And what does that mean? What that means is fee-for-service, the more you did, the more you got paid. You got paid for every single thing you did off of card. A la carte. Fee for value is more along the lines of implementing quality metrics to assure that did you do what needed to be done for a person who needed it to be done, when they needed it done, and then were they happy about it? I mean, that's the easiest way to sum up what the quality metrics are around patient satisfaction, and also there's process measures, outcome measures, and that sort of thing. The quality metrics kind of provide road marks towards benchmarks for payments for these facilities. But that said, clinical lab tests are generally paid off of either the physician fee schedule or the clin lab fee schedule. I'm not going to go into the difference between the two, but just to highlight some changes and proposals that have been going on with the clinical lab fee schedule. Clin lab fee schedule doesn't have its own proposed rule. The public meeting in July only discussed pricing for new CPT codes. They didn't really address any policy, with the exception that CMS indicated a lack of desire to pay either for duplicate analytes or for algorithms such as MAAA tests. Those will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. In the physician fee schedule rule, the CMS proposed to reevaluate CPT codes on the clin lab fee schedule every 5 years according to technological change. What was a little bit concerning to those of us in industry is the view that older tests, or particularly point-of-care tests, as mentioned by Dr. Powderly, should be less expensive. Our position in industry is that many of these technologies and platforms can be reflected in one CPT code, and that just because something is simplified for use in point of care doesn't mean that it's generally less expensive. All of the expense goes into making something so simple that it can be used by other users outside of a healthcare setting or a laboratory setting. The second major proposal this year has been to the outpatient prospective payment system, where lab tests that were provided on hospital outpatients were traditionally paid separately from the ClinLab fee schedule are now proposed to be bundled with the procedure, kind of like a DRG, only for outpatient services. In that particular instance, the molecular pathology codes that were adopted by the AMA last year and implemented with CMS this year would be carved out. These would only include all the other tests that weren't those molecular path codes on the ClinLab fee schedule. And then a couple other things. I don't know if you guys are aware of the medically unlikely edits. That is a way that CMS limits the unit of service. There's not a really transparent, predictable way that this happens. I noticed my company follows molecular microbiology, infectious disease testing. Those units of service went from 2 per organism to 1, just arbitrarily from December to January. Still trying to work through that one. And again, as we discuss all of our capabilities to multiplex reactions, and as was brought up by Francis earlier, if you're doing these multiplex tests or if you're doing a whole genome sequencing test, traditionally a physician had to order the analyte to have a result, positive, negative, be delivered back to the physician before you could bill for it. What happens when you have these panels of 20, 50, hundreds of analytes? Are they billed by analyte? Is it only billed by clinically significant, meaningful use? How are those priced? These are still questions that are way up in the air for a lot of payers. And so with that, the questions and the challenges that we're facing is that while it's clear that payers are seeking evidence of clinical utility, going through a regulatory process, coming into the payer process, as a manufacturer, we generally only collect analytical validity, clinical validity. We don't collect clinical utility. And this has often been difficult for us to attain outside of a partnership with a pharma company because of the indirect links between the diagnostic and the outcomes. The diagnostic provides information that triggers a catalyst, that catalyzes a whole chain of events that leads to a patient outcome. And how do we capture what value that diagnostic brings to that table the best, and what kind of study? What of this data should be collected during or after a regulatory submission? I mean, clinical utility, perhaps that's best in the post-market setting, especially with the increased use of health IT and electronic medical records may make that easier. Again, payments moving from fee-for-service to fee-for-value. But how do we define value? We could be here and discuss it 7 ways to Sunday and still not come up to an answer of how to define value. Whose perspective are we trying to show value? And I'd throw out, not to confuse everything with all the clinical data that we've been tossing around, but what's the role of cost and economic data in this assessment? And who reviews it against what criteria? All these things are still not well known. We know that at least CMS does not use cost as an explicit criteria for determining coverage, but at some point it needs to be in there when you're determining the how much part on payment. And another trend is the increased use of quality metrics. If through this, whether it's a sequestration proposal or reduction in a fee schedule amount, is there some way to kind of balance what's happening on a per test, per patient payment basis with some of these bonus incentives that are happening with some of these bundled demonstration projects around the increased use of quality metrics? How do we appropriately incentivize the use of diagnostics under these bundled payment mechanisms? How are we best able to capture how an investment in something like diagnostics that used to be a cost silo, one cost silo, how can we measure offsets or cost savings in hospitalizations or better use of PharmD? And again, I don't know any of the answers to those questions, so I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleagues here on the panel. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bob McDonough. I'm a head of clinical policy and research and development for Aetna. Aetna is one of the large national insurers having a multi-line of products throughout the United States relating to health, as well as disability, other types of health benefit plans such as vision and dental. And what I'd like to do today is just try to provide just sort of a broad overview of the process that at least one commercial payer uses to evaluate technologies, to talk specifically about molecular diagnostics and oncology. The process can be somewhat of a black box, perhaps. And then finally, I want to talk about one of the new concepts in evaluating medical technologies, including molecular diagnostics, the use of effectiveness guidance documents. I'm a head of our clinical policy unit, which is responsible for determining whether any medical technology is experimental and investigational and excluded from coverage, or whether it's medically necessary. And those terms are defined in the applicable coverage documents. We develop what Aetna calls clinical policy bulletins. Some other carriers might call them medical policies. We post them on the internet. They provide a description of the policy position, a discussion about the rationale for our policy positions, some key references, information about coding that's used to determine how claims and requests for pre-certification are handled. The idea is that in a large company, you need to have objective, consistent policy determinations. The criteria we use for all technologies, you've seen this before, these are the Blue Cross Blue Shield technology evaluation criteria, but I think insurers generally use some variation of these criteria. The most important part of this is about the use, the technology must improve net health outcome. And then, of course, once you demonstrate that, you want to look at how it compares to established alternatives. And the other important point, the final point, is the point about the improvement being attainable outside investigational settings. In other words, are the results of the technology in terms of improving health outcomes generalizable to the usual patient situation for which the technology is intended to be used? We don't create policies on everything. It depends on their importance to Aetna and its members. Usually the issues come up in the context of a request for a coverage or a claim submission, maybe the first time that we become aware of a new technology and have to make a decision about the coverage that we're going to provide. We use all the usual resources in terms of the available peer-reviewed literature, as well as available technology assessments and evidence-based guidelines. In oncology diagnostics in particular, the ASCO guidelines are important. Also, the new National Comprehensive Cancer Network Molecular Diagnostics Compendium, which is recently launched, is going to be influential. It's too soon at this point to know whether it's going to be as influential as their drugs and biologics compendium in terms of defining the standard of care for coverage. We have a process that involves review by physicians in our clinical policy council. All of the items are reviewed by the head of the medical policy department under the auspices of our chief medical officer. And then, of course, once those policies are determined, we implement them into our claims and pre-certification systems. The policies are reviewed on an annual basis by our clinical policy council, and we actually post our review schedule on the internet so that you might anticipate when a particular policy is next scheduled for review. We also provide off-cycle reviews in situations where there's a major new change, a new piece of information that be relevant to a more expedited review of the policy. We also reach out to specialty societies on particular issues. We actually have physicians who are assigned to be liaisons with the major specialty societies, and there are some issues where, especially where a particular specialty society hasn't already formulated an opinion, that we might proactively solicit their feedback. One of the things I wanted to talk about is what are called effectiveness guidance documents. Aetna has been one of the supporters for the Center for Medical Technology Policy in Baltimore, which is a nonprofit research organization. One of the products that they're spearheading is the creation of effectiveness guidance documents, one of which they recently published is on molecular diagnostics in adult oncology. These are analogous to the FDA's guidance documents, but the idea is that it's going to focus more on guideline developers, payers, and patients in terms of the type of evidence that they might need to be able to provide reliable evidence to make decisions. And the other unique aspect of these effectiveness guidance documents is that they're looking at specific diseases or specific class of technologies as opposed to just general guidance. The effectiveness guidance document on molecular diagnostics, which you can actually access, just Google CMTP molecular diagnostics and you can access it. It is freely available. It has some specific types of recommendations that I think provide more information to a product developer than any single commercial payer can provide. They actually use a multi-stakeholder group to develop the recommendations to be able to ultimately provide some predictability to product developers into what are the types of things that a payer might want to have in terms of the evidence development to be able to ensure more predictable payment, as well as how these tests might actually be incorporated into clinical guidelines. The effectiveness guidance document focuses on the things that I think the payers are most interested in. So they do have some statements about analytic validity, just simply that you want to focus on standard reporting guidelines. But the focus really of the document is on the clinical validity and clinical utility. And many of these points have been already discussed today, but it's important for payers. Some of the basic principles of making sure that you validate these tests in the patient populations that you intend to test. To be able to have the appropriate metrics for clinical validation. They have some basic information about that in their document. But in terms of the clinical utility, you need to actually map out the clinical pathways and in terms of how you intend to use the test. And then you want to select outcomes, especially outcomes that are important to patients. And one of the things about the document is they advocate the use not only of the usual objective outcomes that we expect in oncology, but also the idea of incorporating patient-reported outcomes. They talk about the study designs that are important. Of course, randomized controlled trial design selection is optimal if it's possible, but they also talk about the use of prospective retrospective studies in situations where you have banked archive specimens that you can access. They also provide some information about when even a single-arm study might be useful. For example, when you're developing a diagnostic test for a drug which is already demonstrated to be proven effective by the FDA. There's also some room for well-designed prospective observational studies in situations where a randomized controlled trial or a prospective retrospective study is not feasible. And even modeling techniques might be useful when there's good evidence for modeling and greater certainty around the parameters that you might use in the modeling, so that you can actually model some of using the decision analytic techniques, some of the things that you might not be able to do in an actual clinical trial. And the Center for Medical Technology Policy is not only developing effectiveness guidance documents for molecular diagnostics, but they're also now initiating a new effectiveness guidance document to talk about sequencing of drugs in oncology. Also, outside of oncology, they created effectiveness guidance documents on wound care, and they're looking at developing effectiveness guidance documents in the role of diabetes and metabolism, with some of the topics soon to be developed. So I think this is the type of approach that I think could be very useful, especially when payers are challenged with all of the new technologies, and of course, and often are challenged with being able to provide individual consultation to all of the different manufacturers about really what are you looking for in terms of making a reimbursement decision. To be able to provide that level of detail in a multi-stakeholder format and to get a general agreement so that everyone is more certain about really what are the goals, I think is going to be a very useful endeavor. So thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Louis Jacques from CMS. If I used slides instead of my phone, there'd be an asterisk after my name, and the footnote would say, "I'm the devil you know." And I may be the devil you miss in a few years. As healthcare changes, we'll see what happens. My first premise, confident consumers buy more stuff. Why are insurers so reluctant to get enthusiastic and really embrace molecular diagnostics? Because half the time we have no idea what on earth we're paying for, okay? If you had to go to the grocery store and instead of buying whether it's pancake mix or a loaf of French bread, what you got was basically a bag that you couldn't see, and the ingredients were listed on the outside, and you had yeast, flour, or whatever, but you didn't know what it was, you'd probably be a little reluctant. People before me have talked about the need for standards, the need to make a value proposition, and I will also argue we need transparent and unbiased review. People buy cars because they're pretty confident that the people who make cars have to follow certain rules, and there are folks out there, whether it's Consumers Reports or whether it's someone else, who've created and developed and nurtured a reputation for unbiased review. So people look at Insurance Institute for Highway Safety crash ratings and things like that. And people engage in that market because they're pretty confident that they're going to get something that they know they want. And if you can create that kind of environment around molecular testing, I think we'll fall over ourselves in terms of our eagerness to throw money at you. So I got 3 other topics I want to talk about. The first is FDA and CMS. And for disclosure, I am also considerably older than Liz, okay? I think I had a Rico Petrocelli baseball card at one time when I was a child. But I grew up in Washington, D.C., and the Red Sox used to beat up on the Senators even after we hired Ted Williams, Mr. Red Sox, to be our manager. So I guess I've been accustomed to futility. The folks in OIVD have been close professional friends of the coverage and analysis group since probably around 2005. And I remember having some conversations with them about all sorts of stuff that had nothing to do with molecular diagnostics. We were, who knows what it was, but it was, oh, okay, you guys regulate these things. Tests are devices. Okay, so that's where if we have a question as to what exactly does this label mean, you're the people we ought to talk to. So we actually have a really good relationship with them. Several of them happen to be in my phone if I ever need to talk to them. It's not a secret, we are doing parallel review around a stool DNA screening test for colorectal cancer. Without giving away any secrets, I think that particular thing is making progress. I think, I don't think anybody's been surprised. I think it's a good pilot. We obviously need to wait for all the various processes to play themselves out. But it's clearly a signal that the parallel review pilot, which by necessity can't be all things to all people. We need to choose some topics. We had to choose some topics. The fact that we chose a diagnostic, I think, is important. We think diagnostic tests are quite important. We are in the midst of reviewing our IDE regulations by which we will pay for the investigational device in an IDE trial. We think although not all the public commenters, I think, were quite as enthusiastic. But we think that the opportunity to get CMS feedback on your clinical trial is actually an opportunity that more people should be enthusiastic about. Because whatever questions or concerns we might have about your clinical trial paradigm, you're likely to see again when the trial's done and you come to us for coverage. So if there is something that will cause a fundamental question, isn't that priceless for you to know that 3 years in advance rather than, okay, this is what we have, I'm committed to what I have because it's all I got, and we're just going to have an argument about it. Okay, if there's a way early on to get feedback, we think that's particularly of value. So we encourage test developers to engage with our colleagues at FDA. When people come in to meet with us, one of the first things we ask them, what's your status with FDA? And if they say, we are actively engaged with FDA on the approval or clearance of our test, we actually congratulate them on that. I've actually told people, whoever in your company made that decision, you ought to give them a raise because you just made your job considerably easier with us. Because if you haven't gone through FDA, we don't even know that you have analytic and clinical validity other than the fact that you're telling us that you have it. It is tremendously reassuring to us. Let's go back to consumer confidence. If we know that an unbiased reviewer has taken a look at this stuff and says, at least for the things they're claiming, we're in a pretty good place. So let's move to evidence. All the evidentiary issues that folks like Dan brought up in the previous panel, thank you, Dan, you saved me from having to say all that stuff. We absolutely love clinical utility. When we convened a public meeting of our MedCAC, and we've convened several on molecular diagnostics, what has been very clear is a ringing and enduring endorsement for the ACE criteria developed through the EGAP process. We absolutely want clinical utility. Can you sneak through without it? Well, it's like, you're in college and there's an exam. And you've heard of somebody down the hall in your dormitory who managed to pass with a score of 68. Should you aim for 68 in your studying? That's probably not a great strategy, okay? So why don't you aim a little bit higher and try to give us a seamless evidentiary chain that goes from your test to clinical utility. If you have to build that based on a whole bunch of intermediate links, those are simply more places where more people can sort of say, well, how strong is that link? How strong is that link? How strong is that link? I realize it's a new paradigm in diagnostics, but unless physicians are going to tell patients when we're getting these tests, by the way, we're going to order this test for you, and we have no clue whether you're going to be better off for having it or not, which is the truth in advertising. Okay, unless physicians are saying that to each and every patient, I'm ordering this and who knows, it might help you, it might not. And I suspect those conversations aren't happening. Then we really need to get to clinical utility. So what are our additional challenges to payer enthusiasm? When I went to medical school in the late 1970s and took immunology, I never heard the word receptor promiscuity. Fine, you've developed a receptor, and the old lock and key paradigm turns out not to really be a lock and key paradigm. It's sort of kind of loosely might look like one, but there's a whole lot of other ways to get that particular door open or to even, in fact, go through the window. Tumors probably evolve. Are we going to end up treating tumors the same way we treat bladder infections? I don't know if we're going to get to that point. But chemo-resistant tumors are certainly an interesting paradigm. And the fact that, I told someone one time, that's fine, you've discovered a tumor pathway, you've discovered a tumor pathway. And the fact that you blocked that one doesn't necessarily give us reassurance that the tumor isn't simply going to use a different pathway, and maybe that one's even worse for the patient. So why don't we find out what's good for the patient or not? Are there additional factors that affect the relative benefit or harm downstream from post-test patient management? I don't know. Are there certain things that are simply better tolerated if you're younger than if you're older, if you do or don't have certain other clinical predictors? And lastly, are these tests interchangeable? If a patient gets a CBC, and then they go to another hospital and their hematocrit is significantly higher or lower, physicians tend to go, okay, your hematocrit is higher or lower, you are more or less anemic. If you have a spot on your lung that didn't appear on previous chest x-ray, even if it was done in another hospital, you may want to get the old films, but you have a sense that you're at least looking at different apples potentially in the same bucket. What do you do with a molecular diagnostic? These things clearly are not interchangeable. We had a patient testify at a MedCAC meeting earlier this year. We were talking about tests for tumors of unknown origin. And this patient, on his own, decided to have multiple tests, multiple different platforms, and he got different answers. Okay, so one was you have a 50% likelihood of this one, a 30% likelihood of that one, and a 20% of likelihood of something else. The next one was, well, we think you're like 75% over here, 25% over here, and we don't have this third one there. If the test result is going to be so idiosyncratic that different test platforms supposedly looking for the same thing give you results that would lead to markedly different actions by your physician, where's the value there? And I'll just stop there.
All right, thank you, panelists. That was great. And I wanted to actually thank AACR and AdvaMedDx. I meant to do that earlier. Thanks for holding this great conference. We talked earlier about doing more with less, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, and that obviously trickles down to payers, providers, physicians. One person this morning, I missed the session, but I was told that one person this morning actually said that reimbursement is the biggest barrier to patient access. So I wanted to kick off with that question for each of the panelists. What is your reaction to that comment, and what could be improved in your mind?
I think the biggest barrier to patient access is good evidence that what they would get access to is something that would actually help them. If you have good evidence, my staff will fall over themselves with enthusiasm trying to find a way to pay for your product.
Yeah, I think what we want to talk about is access to tests that have demonstrated value, as opposed to just simple, access to tests of unknown value. I don't know if you can make any assumptions about whether there's any benefit.
I can give a couple specific examples of reimbursement stories in our clinic. So there's different ways to judge access. One is, do you have access to your doctor? Forget about the test. So I'm an example in Charlotte where, because I choose to participate in clinical research trials, one of the major insurance companies says that I can't be on their network because I do clinical research trials. That's the first step of access. Patients can't even see the doc because they're not on network. Okay, and this is a major insurance company in a state where we have a state law that insurance companies are supposed to cover clinical trials. Now that's the new federal Affordable Care Act that has nationwide, all private insurance companies are supposed to cover access for clinical trials. So that's the first access issue we see. The second access issue is, even if patients get in the door to see their doctor and the doctor wants to order a test, most of the diagnostic tests that we do order, we won't get to the clinical utility question yet, but most of the tests we do order are also off-network with insurance companies. So we see, I asked one of the molecular diagnostic companies here today, Foundation One, who has, I'm sure, great sequencing abilities, and I asked them, are you on network with any insurance companies? No. We're trying, but they're not on a network with any insurance companies. So they're in my clinic when I see patients and they bring in information about Foundation One and they want their genome sequenced. There is no reimbursement pathway. Most nowadays, especially with the large deductibles, most patients' insurance companies don't have any out-of-network benefits, or they have very small out-of-network benefits. And then there's access to the diagnostic lab. So first I had access to the doctor, now access to some centralized reference lab somewhere else. Now I'm just a diagnostic lab. Our little Biocitics company had an FDA-cleared platform shown to have prognostic utility. So that's important to me as an oncologist. I want to be able to predict a patient's status of their tumor. Is the tumor growing or shrinking? What's their survival? Do I need to switch regimens? That has huge diagnostic utility. Thank you, CMS, for declaring CTCs, circulating tumor cells, as having clinical utility. To me, that's the one threshold. CMS declares it has clinical utility, it's covered. But our little clinic, Biocitics, or our little diagnostic company, Biocitics, was denied by every major insurance company to be on network, to just run CTCs. So CMS defines it as having clinical utility. I define it as clinical utility, but the insurance company says it doesn't have clinical utility, and I'm off network for Biocitics.
So I work for BioReference Laboratories, and we deal with Aetna. I'm actually an Aetna member. You cover our 4,000 employees at our company, but when you do define clinical validity, such as EGFR testing that informs on putting a patient on a $70,000 drug, how do you assign value to that? Because we don't see a lot of it right now.
Well, we're similar to CMS in terms of the question that we're trying to answer in terms of the clinical coverage is the clinical utility, and the cost issue is actually secondary. The cost issue only comes in where there are two competing technologies. And so we haven't gotten to the point where we have value-based reimbursement. So once that decision is made to provide coverage based on evidence that it improves patient outcomes, then it's only up to the contracting area then to get involved and to figure out pricing. And so it's a sort of a binary kind of process. And in the future, perhaps there will be coverage schemes that incorporate more of a value equation, but that hasn't happened yet.
It's pretty obvious I'm not a third-party payer, but one of the issues is the concerns of the third-party payers, whether doctors will actually behave. And that is, I've been told several times by third-party payers whose names start with a color, but I don't want to, and have to do with Christianity and fight and soldiers that carry shields. But anyway, that doctors will order these tests, but then ignore them and go ahead and do what they do anyway. And that was a particular concern for the 21 gene recurrence scores that was coming through. That medical oncologists get paid, of course, by buying chemotherapy wholesale and selling it back retail to our patients, paid by you all. And it's actually and so when I went in front of the Blue Cross Blue Shield Tech Assessment Panel, and it was told, even though not my data, but the data look quite good, we don't believe doctors will behave because it means they would not be doing what they get paid to do. And I said, geez, that's sort of a cynical approach on your part. And they said, no, it's a realistic approach on our part. I'm actually pleased to say we have behaved. We have data now within the NCCN and a couple other studies now to suggest that the use of chemotherapy in node-negative ER-positive patients has dropped by about 20% because of the use of the 21 gene recurrence score and withholding chemotherapy from patients who have a low recurrence score. So I think, again, it gets back to your value added, because I'm no cost-effective analysis kind of guy either, but if you think of the amount of money it costs to give a course of chemotherapy, that $3,000 or $4,000 test to remove 20% of the chemotherapy we're giving needlessly ends up being a huge savings for you all. And the reason I'm talking A is because I'm pleased that we've actually done that. I'm kind of proud of my field. But the others, Dr. Jacques, did I hear you say that CMS is either considering or would pay for diagnostic test as part of clinical trials if we're testing the test, or did I make that up?
If you are...
Because my head jerked when you said that.
Well, you're lucky my deputy isn't here. She's a Spartan, and since you're a Wolverine, you guys might, do one of those things. What we've proposed is that if your device, and a test platform would be a device, is the investigational device in an FDA-approved IDE trial, that we would actually centralize the review rather than having you have to talk to 15 different local contractors. And that if we essentially approved the protocol based on criteria that we proposed, and the reg is in the process of being finalized, and you don't know what a final is going to look like until it's out there, that in fact we would be able to pay the investigational cost in the clinical trial. under a separate policy, routine costs in clinical trials, that also allows us to essentially pay for the things that a patient would have gotten absent the investigational item or service. Paradoxically, and everybody's been talking about Johns Hopkins today, I have no particular relationship to them other than I work in Baltimore. Someone from Hopkins told me in a public meeting about 3 years ago that Medicare is actually the most simple and straightforward payer when it comes to paying for things in clinical trials, and that they wished everybody would be like Medicare, and that's not something you hear often.
Yes, I won't say that, but, but actually that's really big. Is that likely to be happening in the next few months? I mean, because as we designed the two trials on the right-hand side of the IOM thing, most of the companies that make diagnostics, of course, are small, without deep pockets, unlike the drug companies.
Yeah.
And we are now running a national trial of the 21, and I don't work for GHI either, by the way, but we're running a national randomized trial using the 21 gene recurrence score in node-positive patients to see whether chemotherapy just doesn't work in the low recurrence, not that they don't need it. And it's been difficult to do that because the company itself can't afford to lose hundreds of millions of dollars that cost around the assays. And many of the third-party payers said, why should it cost us money to help them get their assay out there? And we keep saying, because if it is, again, we'll reduce chemotherapy. That's the basis of my long-winded thing earlier.
And we wear multiple hats as a federal agency, just because, as Mark McClellan said, we're also a public health agency. I do think the movement away from stacking codes ultimately is going to be a good thing, because if you can't identify your product in a marketplace, what on earth is the value of branding? And if there is no value to branding, why should you try to create it by creating evidence around your particular product? If cars were sold anonymously, nobody would have any incentive to develop a better car or a safer car. So, you know, we're waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it is an interesting question that we've had some conversations with the folks who fund these sorts of things. If you now have the ability to have brand name level identification in the claims system, does this essentially allow you to bring more money in to actually answer some of these evidentiary questions? But, yeah.
You send me an email.
Can I just piggyback off of that question a little bit and have the panelists talk about physician uptake of diagnostics, particularly docs who are not attached to a large academic medical center?
So from my perspective in the trenches, I think that right now, as you saw from some of my slides, doctors are overwhelmed with reimbursement decline, and then all the new data coming at them is like drinking from a fire hydrant. So, and then the once or twice you do send a molecular profiling sequencing test, your patient gets a bill because they're out of network with the insurance company, and the patient's saying, I got a $20,000 bone marrow biopsy test, you know, to sequence for, say, myelodysplastic syndrome or something. So that sometimes is hard to do. So you don't see that sustainability very often. However, at the same time, just like with any group of providers or professionals, there's early adopters. There's some adopters that have lots of enthusiasm for new tests. I'm one of them. So we want it. We like to do those, and I think that many of my colleagues are and will want to adopt new things. But the hurdles that we talked about, the out-of-network status, the poor reimbursement, patients getting a bill for $20,000 for something like a bone marrow biopsy, those things, you remember that, and you don't want to have to write a letter of medical necessity for your patient on behalf of them. You feel obligated to, but you don't want to have to do that every time you do a bone marrow biopsy.
I'm going to speak in defense of oncologists. I've worked with a lot of them, and they're extraordinarily dedicated to the very difficult task they have. And as John Marshall, a dear friend who's a GI oncologist at Georgetown, says, I'm in a profession where for people with advanced disease, if I treat 100 of them, 96 of them are going to die anyway, no matter what I do. One of them will be cured, and a couple of them will have some sort of intermediate outcome, and it is a difficult thing. And I do sometimes believe that what spurs or what leads to the continuation of therapy in places where testing and others might say, you know, isn't it time to stop? It's not necessarily just, you know, let me bill somebody and make some margin on the drug. It is a very, very difficult conversation to have with a patient. And in my own background as a palliative care doc in a cancer center, it's often the gorilla in the room that the conversation becomes one about hope. And once you start talking about hope and basing discussions around hope, you enter really an evidence-free zone. And if the patient doesn't want to have the conversation, and if the physician feels that having the conversation will somehow impair the patient psychologically or mentally, I think sometimes there is a desperation to continue to do things, you know, sort of the Hail Mary pass. So first of all, I don't think oncologists are you know, all sort of bad people trying to scam the system. But I think the other thing is that in that same setting, the reason why some tests don't get any uptake is I think when the rubber hits the road, there are physicians who, you know, faced with a conflicting or sometimes sparse evidence base, simply say, of all the other things I need to deal with, there simply isn't enough evidence right now for me to really get behind this for my patient. I mean, early adopters sometimes are good. Early adopters also gave us, you know, fen-phen for everybody who thought they had a few too many pounds. So there are risks.
Andy's first.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Dr. Lazarus. So, Dr. Jacques, I came up to ask a different question, but then you said something even more interesting. So you referenced the idea of branding and whether moving away from stack codes would sort of help companies with more specific identification of their tests. But I want to walk you down what might be a logical path from that, which is what are the implications then for test-specific identifiers a la Palmetto and the potential for making differential decisions, not just about coverage, but potentially about payment rates among tests that might be analyte similar, but different technologies, potentially different evidence packages and so forth. Because it seems to me, as soon as you're talking about branding, you're talking about creation of value, establishment of value around, you know, specific tests. So can you talk a little bit about the implications of where we might go in a more value-based world?
Well, I think those are reasonable speculations. You know, just because everything says it's, you know, within a particular category, if there are meaningful differences in performance that are reflected in different outcomes for patients, i.e., you know, one test seems to just lead to Brownian changes in physician behavior, whereas the other one is more informed. My personal opinion, I'm not a political appointee, my personal opinion, frankly, is that payment, not just by us, but by others, should actually be granular enough to recognize meaningful performance differences if those performance differences are reflected at the patient level in some way. So I think this granularity, not only moving away from stacking codes, but even moving towards more granularity than might be apparent in some other coding systems, I think fundamentally is a good thing.
Thank you.
So my questions, two short ones, are for Dr. McDonough. Question one, can I come talk to you? Because Dr. Jacques said I could talk to you. I'm Chief Medical Officer of QIAGEN. I'm Chief Medical Officer of QIAGEN. We're a multinational company that deals with molecular diagnostics and next-generation sequencing. So when I am putting together my clinical utility plans, I'm able to, and I've submitted to FDA, I can go speak to CMS, and we have wonderful dialogues. I've been there twice this year already. Can I come talk to you?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have enough
the
resources. This is why I kind of wanted to talk about the effectiveness guidance documents, because what we are talking about is for the payers to sit down with you and discuss sort of your plans for developing a new product. Unfortunately, we don't have the resources to be able to meet with every manufacturer to discuss their plans for the product development, and that's why I thought it's better to be able to do that in a multi-stakeholder setting and develop these standards so that everybody understands. So we do have meetings with product developers. They're usually at the point where they're introducing their product in development, and it's usually around the decision about coverage or not, and less so in terms of, you know, what do you got in your pipeline, and what kind of advice can we give to you.
Okay. Well, when do you think these multi-stakeholder forums will occur? Do you think it'll occur next year, 2 years, 5 years?
The molecular diagnostics effectiveness guidance document has been published. And so...
Yeah, but in terms of actualizing it and having buy-in across the managed care organizations and the insurers. Let me give you a very quick example, very quick. It appears to those of us who don't do what you do full-time that one of you publishes something, especially if it's negative, and then it is immediately taken up by the others. For example, if the Blues have in their technology assessment documents, if they publish something that's negative, it appears to us who don't do what you do full-time that it's immediately taken as gospel. So why don't you comment on that for a second? Because as we're going through this transformative time, as we're, it seems from what Dr. Collins and others have said, that the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater already, that we've already moved on past single real-time PCR tests, and that the whole focus is on NGS, even though CMS and FDA haven't codified how they're going to be viewing these things yet. So how are you focused on these things? Do you get a negative tech assessment or a positive tech assessment from the Blues or from somebody else? And does that mean that your due diligence can be short-circuited?
I don't know if that's relying on technology assessments from ARC or Blue Cross Blue Shield Tech or CMTP as part of our process would necessarily be short-circuiting. Each of the payers is supposed to develop their policies independently, but they're also relying on the same evidence base. They also have access to many of the same technology assessments. And so I guess it's not surprising that the payers that are looking at these decisions and reviewing the same data might come to the same conclusions.
Just one other quick comment. I find it a bit specious when you say you don't have the resources to meet with just everyone. If I am a manufacturer and I am manufacturing molecular diagnostic tests, that's the gateway to a $70,000 pharmaceutical. I find it a bit specious for you to just brush it off and say, I don't personalize this, by the way, for myself or what we do, but I think there has to be a degree of discretion on who you're going to see and when you're going to see it. I think that there should be a certain kind of resonance on your part and your group's part if a molecular diagnostic is going to be keyed to a $70,000 drug. I would think that you would want to be involved in those discussions in some way or another. I certainly can respect that you don't have infinite resources, but I do think setting a bit of priorities within your own shop might be good.
Yeah, I think that to be fair to all the products that are being developed, I think that we need to have forums, and so I agree with you. But I think it really needs to be a complete multi-stakeholder forum, because if you just look at the number of technologies that we evaluate in our clinical policy bulletins posted on the internet, and then understand that that's only a subset of all the different technologies that we identify and have to create policies around. And we don't have, I don't think any other payer has 30 or 40 people to be able to review these kinds of things. You know, you're dealing with a small subset of people who develop the clinical policies. So that's why I think we need a more efficient way than every payer meeting with every manufacturer about every product that they have in development.
Thank you so much for sticking with us here. Looks like we're a couple minutes over. We'll all be around afterwards if you have a couple of questions. Thank you so much.